Yeah, I'm Rollo Reed. I'm from Christchurch. I'm the director of a steel company, Reed Steel, that designs and makes aircraft hangars and bridges and so on. We export something like 60 to 70% of our work all over the world. Well, I have to say none to the EU for reasons I might touch on. I joined the UKIP because so many damaging regulations and rules were coming to us that it was affecting our business and our ability to export. I complained, and I complained to everybody. I complained to governments, I complained to MPs, I complained to trade bodies and so on. And I got a curious result. And the curious result was a recycling of a number of lies. Jeremy has got a little book that actually mentions most of them. But I'm just going to run through them very, very quickly because they keep coming. If you ever have to write to any government department, you will get the same lies, and you have to be prepared and have the answer to them. And the first one, I have heard Cameron say, I've heard Clegg say, I've heard every lying bastard say over the last 20 years, which is this: 3 million jobs in the UK depend on EU membership. Absolutely false. We import 30% more from the EU than we export to them. Right. There is no way that they could have a tariff barrier. They would lose much more than we would. And anyway, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, would forbid it. Further, Norway and Switzerland, who are in fact non-EU members and the two wealthiest countries in Europe, export relatively more than we do to the EU. Even Mexico's got a free trade agreement with the EU. That lie is a lie. The next one is this: 50% of our trade is with the EU. False. This 50% of our export trade includes 10%, which is exported worldwide through EU ports, what we call the Antwerp effect. We actually export worldwide, and we have to sometimes export through Antwerp and through European ports, because there are so many empty trucks going back to Europe who've delivered goods from Europe to here, that it's actually cheaper for us to export through Antwerp than it is through Felixstowe or Hull or Southampton. It's a ridiculous case, but some of the ships don't even come to the UK because it's cheaper for UK exporters to put their stuff on trucks and send it to Antwerp. And all those are counted as if they are exports. Now, that means that our exports to the EU are 40% of our exports. But exports are only 10% of our economy. So the real proportion of our EU trade is only 4%, not the 50% they claim. The next thing they say is the level playing field in Europe is a huge advantage for our industry. False. There is no level playing field. Every obstacle is put in our way, in the way of our exports. You just try exporting an aircraft hangar to France or Germany, for example. Yet we, the Brits, welcome imports. The trade deficit in goods makes this very clear. It is now more than £4 billion a month, trade deficit with the EU in goods. We import from them £4 billion, £50 billion a year, more from the EU than we export to the EU. That's a tremendous position for them to be in, and a really lousy one for us to be in. It's only our exports worldwide in the City of London that help redress this deficit, but not enough. The next one, the next lie, and it happens all the time, we get it every time: the majority of British companies want to stay in the EU. Now that's a funny thing, because I run a company in the UK and I'm against it, and an awful lot of people that I know who run companies are also against being in the EU. So I tried to find out why, because it came from various government departments, and it did take me about 40 letters before I managed to find out where. The fact comes from a 2006 Mori Captains of Industry poll, which polled mainly FTSE 100 companies, mostly internationals, which are only a very small proportion of our companies. Most SMEs, small and medium enterprises, which are by far the majority, are actually 90% of our economy, would like to get out. And the next one is this: We need to belong to a big club to compete with the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China. Absolutely false. I would expostulate even more rudely if it wasn't for the blind people that are here. The last things we need to compete in world market is stifling, expensive EU legislation, which is why the EU has the lowest growth rate. I put that when I wrote it last year. The EU, of course, has got a negative growth rate. We are being kept in a poor man's club. We're shackled to a sinking ship. So, that's not what I was asked to come about, but it's something I feel quite strongly about.
Well, I agree with every word.
Of being in the European Union. I'm going to define a few terms, first of all. GDP, gross domestic product. You've probably heard about this. Our gross domestic product is now £1,620 billion per year. And if you work that out, because it's impossible to think of trillions and billions, that's £27,000 per inhabitant of this country. Now, what are the costs? First of all, there's a direct cost of the EU. That is money that we are forced to pay by our treaty obligations, of which we get some back. And that is 17,500 million every year, and we get back about 9 billion. So the net cost absolutely directly of money that we just shovel out to the EU is £8,530 million per year.
But they tell us what to do with the money they give back.
You're right, I would have mentioned that. That is actually £53 million per day that we lob out, but the net effect is £23 million per day. And do we really need somebody in Brussels to pay for our roundabouts in South Sea or somewhere? I mean, it is absolute nonsense. Everywhere you go, particularly when you get further north, you find these roundabouts with big EU flags on them, donation from the European Union, funded by the European Union. When we went to our meeting in, what was the name, Southport? What was the name? Right up near Wirral somewhere. We were staying in a lovely hotel which had been rebuilt, and in the middle of it, big blue flag, rebuilt by courtesy of the EU. Naturally, before I left, it was... Right, so that's the direct cost. Now, that's a trivial part of the total cost, because now there is the cost of regulation. The regulation that comes straight from the EU, which affects every one of our businesses, like me, like our business. Now, there are various ways of assessing how much that costs. Everybody needs some regulation. There has to be regulation, otherwise we'll be back to terrible times, so we have to accept the sum. The EU itself reckons that it adds about 2% to the GDP in Europe. Mandelson, that wonderful, successful politician in this country, who was so successful we made him a commissar in the Commission, reckons it's 4% of GDP. Tim Congdon, friend of Maggie Thatcher, which is why he's not here today, reckons that it's something like 5% of GDP, which is 10 times the amount that we lob out directly. So when you hear Labour politicians saying, no, the cost is only 0.5% of GDP, that's not true. It is 11 times that with the cost of regulation. Now, people have got no idea what a billion is. I can't visualise it, so I'm just going to think about it for a second. If you could count £100 in a minute, you could count £1,000 in 10 minutes, couldn't you? You could count £144,000 in a day if you did it day and night without stopping. And that means 52 million in a year. And that means that a billion would take you 19 years to count. And a trillion, 19,000 years. When you start thinking about what our deficit means, what these billions mean, just think what it means. Think of the pile of dosh that it is. Think what you could do with 300, 400 million pounds a day. An average school costs about 10 million pounds to build. An average hospital may cost about 30 or 40 million pounds a year. We could be building a new hospital every day with that money. Now, let's just move on. We've got other things. We've got lost jobs because of the regulation, and we've also got lost jobs because of uncontrolled EU immigration, and that is actually, that's reckoned at 0.25%, but I think it's a lot more, because people that are over here are almost always remittance men. That is to say, they're sending the money back out of this country. Every pound they earn, they're probably sending 20–30% back to there. There is waste and fraud and corruption in the EU, which we've all heard of. I mean, you know, it's now, I think, 17 years since the EU had an audit that passed the audit. They fail their audit every damn year for 17 years. If we were running a company and we bunged in some accounts and the auditors sent them back, we'd probably be in nick. Well, we would be. Next is benefit tourism. We hear quite a lot about it. It's not an enormous deal. It's not a huge thing. It is a fact that most of the people that come here to work rather than to sponge. But even so, it's about 0.25% of GDP. It's about £405 million a year of benefit tourism. It's quite well known in places like Greece and even in places like Uganda, that a doctor says to somebody, if you can't afford the cost of having your hospital treatment here, buy a ticket to England as a student or something, you can have your baby there, it's free on the national health. There is a lot of it. There's another one, which is the extra cost of food over world prices. We are buying all of our food. The reason there's all these empty trucks, our food almost universally comes from Europe. And we are paying more for it in two ways. One way is we're paying more for it than it would cost if we bought it from New Zealand or Kenya or somewhere else, one of our friends in the world. But the other thing is, of course, that we're paying for it because we're paying for the CAP to subsidise it in the first place. Now, if you add all of those things together, you come up to a sum of something like 150, 160 billion pounds a year, which is close to 10% of our GDP. 10% of what the whole of the country is generating is being wasted by our membership of the EU. And that's not, of course, taking into account this trade deficit of 50 billion pounds a year. The current government says that it's bringing down the deficit. They are being very abstemious with the truth, because they are not. They are borrowing 120 billion pounds a year. Remember that, taking 19,000 years to count to a billion? You know, whatever it is. It's a huge, huge, staggering amount. Our national debt is currently 1.2 trillion pounds a year, which is 75% of our GDP. Next year, it's going to be up. It's going to be 83% of our GDP. You know, the Conservative government at the moment is doing nothing whatsoever to cut down neither the national debt or the deficit. And even if they got the deficit down to nothing, that still wouldn't be cutting down this enormous debt. Now, I think it's worth mentioning here how this national debt has moved along since 1990, because 1990 was a good year. Really, we are still recovering from the war in a way. Our debt that we owed other nations had dropped down to 28% of GDP. By the year 2000, that had crept up again to 31%. Actually, that sounds a lot, but it was one of the lowest in Europe at that time. Then we had the benefit of Gordon Brown. Now, Gordon Brown, good Keynesian economist, he studied it at university, never had a job, never had to balance a book, but he knew all about it. And he thought that it was a good idea to invest by borrowing money, which he did. He didn't quite understand the difference between investing and spending, unfortunately. And by 2008, it had risen to 36%. By 2010, which is when Cameron, bless him, came to power and took the reins, you can imagine Tony Blair chuckling as he dropped all these bastards in the fertiliser. It was up to 55% by 2010. 2010 when Cameron and the Conservatives took over. And now, 2013, it's up to 75% of GDP. which is actually one of the higher ones in Europe. And by the time it gets to 2014, 83%. And can anybody see the end of it? No. Just remember, every bit of our trade deficit, every bit of our EU payments, every bit of assistance we give to the IMF or we give to saving EU countries has to be borrowed from world markets. We are borrowing more and more and more every year. So, that's the end of it. If anybody else wants to know and can tell me how to get out of it, I'd be glad to take part in the debate. Thank you.